What if Biden allows Ukraine to use U.S. weapons inside Russia's borders? Russia's nuclear threats are losing their power. Source: Gideon Rachman. Russia's nuclear threats are losing their power. Financial Times. The Western alliance is stepping up support for Ukraine in ways that were unthinkable when the war began. Russia is once again using its nuclear weapons to threaten others. Last week, Vladimir Putin warned NATO countries not to allow Ukraine to use Western munitions to attack Russia. The Russian leader warned of grave consequences and said Ukraine's allies should remember the smallness and dense population of many European countries. If Putin's language was vague, Dmitry Medvedev made an even more terrifying threat. The former Russian president quoted Putin and added, "The use of tactical nuclear weapons can also be miscalculated. This would be a fatal mistake." Medvedev is known for his harsh words. But Moscow has recently taken steps to underscore its menacing posture, with the Russian military conducting nuclear exercises near the border with Ukraine. These moves have not stopped several NATO countries, including the United States, from taking the latest escalation step, authorizing the use of their weapons inside Russia's borders. The latest moves by NATO countries reflect a mixture of confidence and anxiety. On the bright side, the United States and its European allies are now less concerned about the possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons than they were 18 months ago. On the negative side, they are also increasingly uneasy about the situation on the battlefield. Their willingness to allow Ukraine to retaliate against enemy artillery and missile bases, even if they are located inside Russian territory, reflects concerns that Ukraine is losing the war. As a result, Kiev's Western backers feel compelled to accept greater risks to keep Ukraine fighting. The West's willingness to accept this level of risk represents a dramatic shift in its thinking since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022. Back then, NATO countries were wary of providing Ukraine with any offensive weapons. Each major new capability provided to Kiev long-range missiles, tanks, fighter jets was accompanied by lengthy, sometimes acrimonious debate in the West, and by nuclear threats from Russia. But each time NATO countries crossed a new threshold, the Kremlin did not follow through on its nuclear threat. And that made it easier for the Western alliance to make the next move. But the fact that the United States and its allies are no longer so worried about Russia's nuclear posture does not mean they have completely dismissed the threat. Indeed, some Western officials remain deeply concerned about the potential for escalation that would involve allowing Western-supplied weapons to be used against Russian territory. They worry that Russia will view this latest move as an escalation of a proxy war with the West, and may respond with what it sees as a proportionate response involving counterattacks on NATO territory. That could bring Russia and NATO very close to the direct conflict that Western leaders have sought to avoid. Russian military doctrine is believed to assume that Moscow cannot prevail in a conventional war with the West, and would therefore contemplate the use of nuclear weapons early on. Despite French President Emmanuel Macron's comments about deploying French troops to Ukraine, the Western alliance is still trying to maintain a clear red line against direct involvement in a conflict with Russia. When Iran recently launched a barrage of missiles at Israel, the US and its allies directly helped shoot them down. But Ukraine has not received such support when it has been hit by Russian missiles targeting its cities and infrastructure, in part because of the risk that Western air forces could fire directly at Russian forces. Currently, the US still places significant restrictions on how far Ukraine can go in retaliating against Russian forces with US-supplied weapons. Under the new policy, Ukraine is free to strike at Russian forces firing at Ukraine from just across the border. However, strikes at targets deep inside Russian territory have not been approved. Despite concerns about Russia's potential response to this latest move, US decision-makers still consider the scenarios that could trigger a Russian nuclear response to be remote. The two most talked about scenarios are when Russian forces are about to be routed on the battlefield, or if Ukrainian ground forces threaten Crimea, which Russia formally annexed in 2014. The closest the world has come to the real nuclear crisis in Ukraine will come in October 2022, when Russia suffers a series of catastrophic defeats in the war, including the loss of Kherson. There was a weekend when Western officials were deeply concerned that Russia was close to using nuclear weapons. But that crisis also created a new playbook for how to deal with Russian nuclear threats when they become truly serious. Step 1 is to talk to your Russian counterparts, and threaten that the West will become directly and deeply involved in the conflict. Step 2 is to talk to other powers, especially China and India, and get them to warn Russia, preferably in public. For now, that playbook remains in a drawer. But it will probably be used again before the war in Ukraine is over one way or another.